Yeah, I think Loaded came out right now, this week, 20 years ago.
How did we manage to plan
Do you know what? I should be fucking asking them how they managed to blag it. Not how I managed to blag it, because they made tens of millions of pounds out of it. Well, out of this conversation, they said, Alan rang up the guy who'd been my boss at NME and said, look, we can't offer you the job, sadly. Do you want to do that magazine you talked about? So I wrote a sheet of what it would be and then spent about a year developing it. And eventually it came out, and to wide expectation of huge failure.
Really?
Because the perception was that women read magazines. Women's lifestyle magazines have existed for most of the 20th century, and but the one that went populist, which was perceived to be about what women were really like, was in the early 70s, was with Cosmo, and no one had done that for men. So in all that time that the rumours were going out that IPC were developing a young men's magazine, there were just articles saying this won't work, men don't read magazines like women do, but I knew that they did, because I used to read all those questionnaires in the women's mags, which I don't know if they're still in the women's mags, but are you a good lover? Multiple choice. All of that. Do you remember those? Are they still in the women's mags? Every women's mag had a multiple choice questionnaire. I was reading them, but also even the women's magazines I thought were shit. They didn't have anything the women I knew were into, like clubs or drinking or anything. So, so that was how Loaded got launched. Was we did research in rooms, and the blokes didn't have a clue what we're talking about. They read Motorcycle News, Viz, Shoot, Photography Today, a paper. No one that we were talking to could get their head around the idea that all of the things they're into would be in one place. So we did the research, and then we kept. After about 3 months of doing it, I had one guy, then I got another guy, and we did some dummies. It was called The Right Stuff all the way through, after the Tom Wolfe book. That wasn't going to be the launch name, that was just the project name. So we had all these big, thick dummies with like Stereo MCs and Dennis Leary and U2 and people like that on the cover. Phil Tufnell, I remember we had on one. And what I said was, the people on the cover should be new, up and coming and dangerous, or knackered and past it. I could have got on in both cases now. I fit both bills. And
it's 20 years.
Yeah. So, but what Alan had to do this presentation to the board, and IPC Magazines was the biggest publishers in Britain, and it was known within the publishing industry as the Ministry of Magazines. And Prince Charles used to send his Molly, do you want this done? Prince Charles used to send his chauffeur around to get copies of Horse and Hound. It was a very staid environment, and they were nervous that we were going to have sexual content, and we weren't. In the dummies, there was no sexual content. There was hardly any sexual imagery. It was all football and music. That's all it was. And very near the end, they said you should have some girls in there and you should have some fashion in there. That was what the company wanted, and it just wasn't an issue. We weren't the sort of blokes who didn't have girlfriends. We had lots of mates who were girls, and so we didn't need to have those how to get a girlfriend style articles, which the women's mags had. And anyway, so to give them the tone of voice of what was being published by IPC and by other publications, I did a massive mood board, about as big as half of that curtain, and I blew up on the photocopy all the headlines from women's magazines. And in the middle of it, A4 size, there was a headline from More, which was a mag for 15-year-old girls, and it said, how to give a blowjob. So Alan did this presentation, and he changed all the research results. Because in those days it was all handwritten, it wasn't digital. He changed them all, he put them all up by about 25%. So he cheated on that, and he explained what the magazine was going to be and about, young men's lifestyle. And then he showed them this message, this mood board, with how to give a blowjob in the middle. And this was to the board of IPC, who were owned by Reed Elsevier, who were various other, they owned a missile company. a big multinational corporation, and then he'd give all the projected numbers. And the idea was we'd make our very low-cost launch, about 3 people on the staff, not paying them anything, and after 3 years it'd make its first pound of profit. So when he'd done all of that, about what the mag would be, the research, the financial projections, the tone of voice, don't worry, it'd be okay, I'll look after them. He's not going to punch any more security guards. And at the end, the chairman of IPC said, oh, thank you, Alan, that was very interesting. What's a blow job? Alan gave him one, we got the green light. That last bit's not true, but we did get the green light. And they did pay us shit money, and there's only 3 or 4 of us, but it made its first pound of profit after 12 weeks.
I mean, it was a phenomenon.
It was the fastest payback ever in British publishing history.
Really?
Yeah. It did change British publishing. In fact, it changed the whole world publishing. Because it created a genre that hadn't been there, which was a populist mainstream magazine. And that fella that had a go at me before I left for being a sexist, if you actually looked at Loadeds now, if I'd bought all the old ones, you just wouldn't know what the fuss was about. There was nothing in it. The front covers were the men that we admired, and
what was the first?
The first cover had Gary Oldman on. Okay. It was supposed to have Paul Weller, and we photographed Paul Weller, and we did a good interview with Paul, and then they were worried that people would think it was a music mag. So we moved Paul off the cover, and then we were going to get Eric Cantona, and we couldn't get a decent photo of Eric.
Actually, just stop there. He asked me earlier on to ask you about Eric Cantona, Dean.
Oh, right.
About Eric Cantona.
Oh, that night we met him.
Can Girls and some...
No, when we met Eric at Joe Strummer, I'll tell that in a bit. That's a good story. That ended with Eric Cantona had a headlock.
Who had him in a headlock?
Paul Buck, who was a Man United fan.
Right, yes.
That was a great night, wasn't it? Yeah. That was a great night. I'll just tell that very quickly. Me and Dean went to this party to celebrate Joe Strummer, because he died, shortly after he died, and it was at his Damien Hirst's agent's art gallery, so it was a big place, and there was a lot of people, a lot of famous people that we would have admired that were there, and a lot of people you forgot you'd admired, like UB40 and the Stranglers, but I remember we were talking to Bob Geldof and his Mrs. Frenchwoman that he'd married, and there was like lots of genuinely really, really top musicians there. Obviously the Clash were there. Who were we talking about when he walked in?
I think we were talking about Cantona when he walked in.
Well, anyway, we were Dean and I were chatting, and he suddenly goes, it moved to a nightclub, because it got to about 11:30, and the art gallery shut. And it was a weird night, they were celebrating the life of someone everyone admired who died a few months before. And I remember Dean going, "Fucking hell, Eric!" And like the door had swung open like a cowboy film. And these 5 fellas just walked in with sleeping bags under their arms. And they just walked in, they had camo jackets on, leather jackets, collars up, 5 of them, they looked like a gang. And it was the Cantona brothers. It was like Eric and his 2 or 3 brothers, and they just walked in with, I'm not joking, they had sleeping bags, and because they'd got the last plane from Marseille. Eric had come from a match or training. He was, I don't know, had he retired or whatever, but he was living in Barcelona. He lives between Barcelona and sort of that part of the world, Pyrenees, I think, and they came in, it was like, fucking hell, Eric, even though he'd gone to the other side, it was still Eric.
We sold him though.
And it was, it was fantastic. And there was me, Dean, and this Cockney red hooligan called Faz. And we went straight over to him, and the 5th bloke with him was a guy called Richard, who was a French photographer, and we got chatting. And I said, "You're not the bloke who photographed Eric with the Maori war paint on?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm the guy that put that on the front of GQ. I was the editor." And he immediately goes, "Eric!" Blah, 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 and he comes over and says, "Monsieur editor GQ," and all of that. Eric goes, ugh, you know. But that was it. Then Penny Smith, the great Clash photographer, took our picture. Dean, myself, Faz, the Cockney Red hooligan, and Eric. And have you ever seen that picture? And Paul Buck. Have you seen that picture?
No.
I haven't either. It might not. It might be making it all up.
No, definitely.
And anyway, they moved us to a bit which was like that. Those VIP areas that used to be popular. You just basically separate you from all the interesting people, and put you all the fucking boring famous people. But anyway, Eric was there. And Paul just got him in a headlock and was kissing him. And Eric's like this. Eric's just looking at me, going, "Who's this?" I was going, "Paul Buck, sportsman, you, Eric."
So you were going to put him on the cover, but you had to...
So anyway, there were no decent pictures of Eric to put on the cover because no one had thought to make him look like a Maori warrior yet. And so we put what is it on the cover? We put Gary Oldman because obviously being a film star, there were a lot of photographs of him, and he was more in tune with a sort of, you know, and I think he had a kind of New York bent cop gangster film out. And we bought an interview in, and I wrote a thing about why I thought it was great. And I went off then. I went off to New York. I went off to LA and interviewed the Beastie Boys. And I went to Barbados and smoked grass with Phil Tufnell, who was playing for England at the time. So suddenly it was a bit different. Instead of smoking grass with like the Beastie Boys, as I'd done the week before, I was sitting in the England training camp with these enormous, they used to sell it in A4 school foolscap paper. That's how big the Rastas or whoever the fellas was selling it. So much of it. And he's like in the middle of a test match. And I remember him going, "Oh, fuck his wingers, dingers. Don't tweet this because we'll get him into trouble." And he's putting his spliff out, and there's the England, you got to remember this England cricket team, you know. And the England cricket, the vicar had come over to make sure he was okay. They used to take a vicar on tour with them in the 90s. I don't know if that was just because Tuffers was in the team or he knew he needed special guidance. But he was a fantastic bloke. So Tuffers was the first, Tuffers and the Beasties were the first people I interviewed, I think, for the second issue.